Okay, another Saturday, another study. This time studying Matthew 16, the controversial Matthew 16. All right, on with the show. Matthew 16, the fulfillment of the next Isaiah chapter as we continue in this fulfillment theme in this continuing examination of Isaiah. Now, in this continuing theme, we might try to claim some sort of fulfillment of those Pharisees and Sadducees. Presumably, some of those Pharisees and Sadducees recently forecasting stormy skies on the horizon, as per verse 3 of this chapter. Stormy skies indicated by a red sky morning, indicating some clouds coming in from the east, as opposed to hot air coming in from the southwest. Now, there is some general truth to that weather forecasting axiom, some. Yet that simply wasn't the case at this particular time, not literally anyway. If that was the case, then it appears to be showing utter contempt when Jesus and his disciples went across the lake. Anyway, across the lake in their boat, since they knew the sky was not to be trusted, but that Jesus alone was to be trusted. They learned their lesson earlier, right? Right? Metaphorically, however, that forecast was the case. That's why those Pharisees plotted to kill Jesus as early as Matthew chapter 12. And we're on to 16 now. And they asked for a sign from him then as well. Yes, they could see a serious storm a-coming, and it wasn't from the sky. Having said that, you should probably know that those two weather-wise verses are not in our earliest manuscripts. Those two verses seem to have been imported from Luke chapter 12. Yeah, in a twisted fashion. Imported in order to fill in a bit of a void in our text. To fill a void in order to develop a conversation about a literal sky when the metaphysical heavens, yes, Verno, are actually being referred to. Metaphysical heavens, despite some peripheral association with Jonah, with the weather. Metaphysical heavens to settle an internal dispute between the Pharisees and those Sadducees who didn't believe in that symbolic resurrection of Jonah. However, something far bigger than the weather is being referred to now. Something far bigger than the sky. That kingdom of heaven judgment is being referred to once again. And a less symbolic repeat of that Jonah incident, yes, to implicate their disbelief. A less symbolic repeat. What do we mean by that? Well, failing that immediate fulfillment of a storm, we might claim that there was some form of fulfillment of the sign of Jonah, as per our more immediate verse 4 now. Except that the resurrection from the depths some 3 days later was still some time away, at least a couple more weeks away. So no immediate fulfillment in this particular chapter, right? Right? Well, not unless there is some sort of parallel of Jonah being told to go to Nineveh. Nineveh. And that seems to be the case here. Indeed, that seems to be the case in now fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah 52 in our present verse 21. Isaiah 52. The prophecy of the Lord not going to Nineveh now, but rather coming to the waste places of Jerusalem, as you read in Isaiah, verse 9. A place that will soon be laid waste to by Rome. Of the Lord now coming to bear his holy arm. Bear his holy arm. What does that mean? Bear his holy arm. Whoa. Yeah, bear his holy arm. Bearing his arms in the sight of all the nations. We read in verse 10 of that Isaiah chapter. Bearing his arms in the crossroads of the Middle East at the most populous time of the year. Bearing them that they may be marred more than any man, as we read in that chapter, verse 14. Marred by those Pharisees and Sadducees, arms that were previously identified as being judging arms in Isaiah chapter 51. To that end, Jesus says that he must now go to Jerusalem, and right now, go to suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law. Yeah, to suffer at the hands of the unholy trinity of hypocrites, if you will. A trinity that should also include you and me. To suffer many things from unclean hands. Unclean hands. If you were following our previous study, we spoke to the unclean aspect. Hands that would literally be defiled with his blood. But more so, souls that would be fatally defiled by their murderous thoughts. So, off they went to Jerusalem. But, before that dogged determination to suffer at the hands of Jerusalem, they made one last stop at Caesarea. One last stop for what may have been a few more healings at the northernmost region of the country of Israel. A few more miracles for those deluded folks that had a tendency to worship a goat-shaped god named Pan, rather than worshiping a suffering servant-shaped God named Jesus. Miracles that would end up multiplying their overwhelming guilt of unbelief. So, to that Caesarea end, they went heading northeast across the lake. Not to the other side this time. Across the lake. From somewhere southwest upon the lake. And then they parked the boat for a while. Most likely docking it with Peter's dad at Capernaum before heading out to Caesarea Philippi. Yeah. Which is to say, heading out to the northern Caesarea of Philip, as opposed to the western Caesarea on the Mediterranean Sea. Perhaps for a second sojourn at that majestic city. At which point, where along that point? Don't know. At which point Jesus extracts the grand confession out of Peter, the grand confession. He extracts something that looks a whole lot like the grand confession of Isaiah chapter 51, verses 1 and 2. Perhaps Jesus was teaching them that chapter at the time. The grand confession of Jesus being the Christ. Yes, the Greek term, the Christ. There we go. Christos is used in our text. Christos. As opposed to the synonymous Hebrew term, the Messiah. Yes, Christos. Either way, Both of those terms mean anointed one. Anointed one. It appears that our respectful NIV is appealing to the Hebrew transliteration for you instead. That's nice. Appealing to that Hebrew word exclusively throughout Matthew. Exclusively. Since it is presumed that Matthew was always referring to a fulfillment of good old Hebrew prophecy. So let's use the good old Hebrew word instead, right? Though it seemed John, Paul, and even Peter were not nearly so respectful or retro, according to our NIV. So they occasionally granted the Christ term by our text instead. The Christ term, Christos. Incidentally, the squiggly in the margin of our Codex Sinaiticus. See that? There's a squiggly for you. It's called a sigla. Let's call it a squiggly. What does that mean? That supposedly means, if you follow that link, it means that this grand confession is well put or of timely importance. Important as in the Latin nota bene or NB that we might mark in the margins of our present day and age. And that importance certainly is the case. Certainly is. However, this is a sigla that we also find in less important spots as well. And you can find those spots in Judges, those verses there. So that sort of beauty seems to be in the eye of the beholder sometimes. Seems to be pretty subjective at times. Now, when exactly that sigla was actually added to the text, when was that added to the text? Don't know. Really don't know. Perhaps in the 10th century, when similar sigla were written into Codex Vaticanus, those codexes seem to have a parallel history. What we do know is that it was definitely later, definitely sloppy, and definitely different ink in the margin. So we really shouldn't give those sigla all that much respect. Although we still have to give that grand confession all due respect. To that end, it is still a Protestant position that it is upon that grand confession that Jesus will build his church. Upon that solid rock of a confession. Not upon some petrified rock as Peter was later to become in Matthew chapter 26, and not upon some satanic rock or roadblock that Peter was presently exemplifying in verse 23 of our present chapter. No, Peter was just being a Charlie Brown of a blockhead at the moment. Just like most of us are when confronted with an unpleasant truth. Yes, most of us are. That being said, the fabled pearly gates of Peter and the wild consideration of the primacy of the Pope, primacy of Peter, came at a much, much later date. That papal understanding was a much, much later misunderstanding that occurred around the late 6th century. According to the formidable historian Philip Schaff, that understanding only came somewhere around the time of Gregory I. Somewhere around the time that Gregory the Great humbly declared himself to be the servant of the servants of God. Wow. Claiming to be the greatest servant, of course. And even our non-committal Wikipedia agrees that historically the primacy of Peter was not the proper understanding of any of the earlier fathers of the faith. Indeed, those early Greek fathers had a far better understanding of our Greek text than Latin Rome ever did. Take, for example, the polyglot Origen. Oh, let's hunt him down. Our polyglot Origen. And a lot of these references I find in here, this is a really good set of books. Tremendous set of books to consult. A little better than Wikipedia, for that matter. And we'll take a quick look at Appendix A in this book, which deals with an exegesis of these particular verses. And it goes through a lot of early fathers and what their considerations were of those verses. And with respect to Origen, well, let's just, there's Origen there. Whatever. Origen, the great scholar Origen, who wrote a Bible in 6 different languages. According to Origen, he said, for a rock is every disciple of Christ of whom those drank. Did you catch that? A rock is every disciple of whom those drank. And upon every such rock is built every word of the church. Every. Or take, for example, Jerome, who was around 400 AD. We'll just quote that from here then. Jerome, who said, the rock is Christ, who gave to his apostles that they should also be called rocks. And as you can see, we can multiply those references at great length. Oh, well, let's give you one more reference just for fun. Let's give you, say, Augustine. Christ, you see, built his church not on a man, but on Peter's confession. Yes, the grand confession. What is Peter's confession? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. There's the rock for you. There's the foundation. There's where the church has been built, which the gates of the underworld cannot conquer. Yes. So, those references were not on Rome's side, and rarely were they on Rome's side elsewhere. Roman Catholics. Indeed, those earlier folk had a far better understanding of what the subject of the verse was and what the object of the verse was. And it's not necessarily a syntax thing either. It's a contextual thing. France disputes the grammar of those ancient Greek fathers, however. Our commentator R.T. France, despite them actually being Greek and so much closer to the source. Still, he calls that subject-object reversal a cheap escape route from Rome. And he calls that an exegesis of desperation, claiming that there are better ways of minimizing the primacy of the Pope. Okay. However, with respect to Matthew 16:16, we have an overwhelming consensus from those fathers long before the power-grabbing papacy was even considered by the not-so-innocent Pope Innocent. And a consensus long before that power-grabbing was attempted by the more ferocious Pope Leo. An overwhelming consensus over the highly unusual grammar of this particular passage. Either way, Either way, the flattering response of Jesus to this well-put response of Matthew 16:16 does not negate the later sense in which all of the disciples are considered as rocks, and not just this newly named Peter. And we can read that. We will be reading that in Matthew 18:18, where all the disciples are considered as rocks, as Petros, as Peters, with Jesus being the cornerstone of all those rocks, of course. Yes, with Peter merely being one of many rocks hewn from that cornerstone. What do you mean, hewn from that cornerstone? With other rocks dug from that quarry as well. And you can read that in Isaiah 51:1. Hewn from that quarry. More than one rock. Imagine that. Rocks that include Abraham, if you consider the subsequent verse of that Isaiah chapter. Yes, rocks that happen to include you, if you can believe it. Rocks that include you if you pursue the very same righteousness that Abraham did. If you pursue the righteousness of faith in the Lord. Faith in the Lord. Works notwithstanding. If you pursue the Lord who bared his holy arm through Jesus, bared it, so that all the ends of the earth may see the salvation of our God. Yeah, read that in Isaiah 52. Yeah. So that all the ends may see the salvation of our God. Even America. Moving on, we now see reiterated the Christly role that Jesus is about to play. The Christly role, or Messiah, that Jesus is about to play in Matthew 16. About to play the role of Redeemer of Jerusalem that you can read of in Isaiah 52, Redeemer of Jerusalem. Not surprisingly, to play that very role in Jerusalem. To that completely redeeming end, our present verse 21 now contains the full term, Jesus and Christ, in the uncorrected versions of our earliest and finest manuscripts. There we have Jesus and Christ. All right? Jesus and Christ. And according to France, those manuscripts are not being the least bit superfluous in tying those two names together. Not being the least bit unthinking, as many moderns are that dully consider this to be the formal name of Jesus. Those that wouldn't think twice about using the first name without the last name. And that superfluous nominative is used in the foremost manuscript Sinaiticus, which is this one, as well as Codex Vaticanus. Two manuscripts that generally seal the deal for any textual decision by any sound biblical committee. However, unlike the more literal NASB, our NIV here, opted to be a little less superfluous here, opting to rely on the later corrections. Corrections? What do you mean? Later corrections, even if it ignores the immediate context. Yes, corrections. Note the X corrections by a later hand in Sinaiticus here. with that later hand, or two, not really knowing which name to X out. Sloppy. Sloppy again. Yeah. Almost as sloppy as my highlighting. Okay. Textual criticism done with. As regards to other difficulties in this chapter, well, we have Jesus talking about the yeast of the Pharisees again. The yeast of the Pharisees, repeating himself even in verses 6 and 11. So what exactly is that yeast? That metaphoric yeast, right? Since we know that literal yeast is not really an issue according to our previous chapter. What is that metaphoric yeast that the disciples are repeatedly told to be on your guard against? Unfortunately, our commentators are not helpful there at all. R.T. France calls it a puzzling little package and something that remains at the level of a parable without an explanation. Yes, France is being uncharacteristically cautious there, preferring to leave that yeast alone. But if we are dealing with the immediate context, it would be the yeast of demanding even greater miracles from Jesus. The yeast of demanding even greater miracles from Jesus. Demanding irrefutable proof. An exercise in futility, according to Jesus. An exercise illustrated by those historic feedings, now spoken to by Jesus in this passage. Feedings that echoed Moses and the Israelites in the wilderness. Exercises that did not exercise their faith in the least. An evidential proof that was summarily dismissed by nearly all of those that were fed in that way. Nearly all of them. Likewise, we moderns would likely dismiss those miracles as some sort of parlor trick as well. Parlor trick from a somewhat competent magician like David Copperfield or David Blaine, a sleight of hand artist, or whatever. More of a trick than a treat. With our final difficulty of this chapter being the final verse of this chapter. Just exactly who is not going to taste death? And when exactly is the Son of Man coming in his kingdom? Well, our commentators are not much help there either. What we do know, however, is that Jesus was speaking directly to his disciples at that point, and that the disciple Judas tasted death not long after that prophecy of Jesus. That would explain that prophecy being so cryptic, explain it being so hidden to the inner circle of those disciples. Now, wouldn't it? And the day of ascension is a pretty good bet for the Son of Man coming into his kingdom at that. Coming to cause a serious kingdom of heaven judgment some 40 days after his resurrection. Causing a serious judgment while seated at the right hand of God the Father. Though it seems that the Father also made some form of judgment at the very moment of the resurrection as well, as we will be seeing in chapter 27. It seems that the Father also raised some others from the depths at that momentous occasion. That is, if France is going to be consistent about the literal nature of that account. And yes, our beloved R.T. France is. No, we don't have to wait until the end of some nebulous millennium for that judgment to finally come. It will be made immediately. It just won't be executed immediately, neither for the saints nor for the ain'ts. In the meantime, the saints will continue to cry out, "How long, Lord? How long?" And the ain'ts will continue to tremble. "Not yet, Lord, not yet." For a little while longer, anyway.